Marcella entered the cafe that morning, expecting just a peaceful day and a cup of coffee. She had no idea that the attendant would treat her disrespectfully and aggressively. But what the employee didn't know was that Marcella was not an ordinary customer, she was the owner of the cafe. It was a cold, overcast afternoon when Marcella stepped into the small, cozy coffee shop. The faint buzz of conversation filled the air, but it was overshadowed by the hiss of the espresso machine and the quiet clinking of ceramic cups. The familiar scent of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries filled her nostrils. The warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the chill outside, where the clouds seemed to press down on the city like a heavy, suffocating blanket. But despite the warmth of the room, something in the atmosphere felt off. There was a strange heaviness, an unspoken tension that crept into the space, settling over her like a cloud she couldn't escape. Marcella could feel it immediately, the subtle yet palpable discomfort. The other patrons sat in silence, glancing at their phones, sipping their drinks, as though trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone else. She brushed a strand of her curly hair behind her ear, feeling self-conscious under their silent scrutiny. She walked up to the counter, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Her fingertips lightly grazed the cool metal of the counter as she waited for the barista to acknowledge her presence. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, the sharp, acidic scent of the beans mingling with the sweetness of pastries. Marcella's stomach growled, but her mind wasn't on the food. She had come here to escape for a moment, to lose herself in the simple pleasure of a good cup of coffee. The young barista, with her platinum blonde hair tied up in a tight ponytail, finally looked up. Her pale blue eyes scanned Marcella briefly, before narrowing slightly as if she had just realized something unsavory. The barista didn't smile. There was no warmth in her gaze, just a kind of indifference that Marcella had come to know all too well. Her lips parted to speak, and Marcella braced herself, almost as though she could feel the words before they left her mouth. "I'm sorry, we don't serve people like you here," the barista said, her tone clipped, her eyes already drifting away as if dismissing Marcella entirely. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Marcella's chest tightened. It wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like she didn't belong. She had faced it all her life, at school, at work, in stores, and on the streets. The microaggressions, the subtle but ever-present judgments. The not quite good enough looks that came from the way she looked, from the color of her skin. This barista, this stranger, had just confirmed all the worst parts of the world she lived in. Marcella had been preparing for this moment in many ways, but that didn't make the sting any less painful. Her mouth went dry. She blinked, unsure how to respond. Her thoughts scrambled, trying to find a way to confront the casual cruelty, but the words didn't come easily. She had learned to internalize so much of this. How could she fight back when it felt like the world was conspiring against her at every turn? How could she be brave when every corner of her existence seemed to tell her that she wasn't worthy? The murmurs from the other customers grew louder in her ears. Their glances shifted, uncomfortable, hesitant. They were watching. Watching her, judging her. Her pulse quickened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. The shame crept in, dark and heavy, but so familiar. Was she imagining it, or had they all heard the barista's words? Could they all see what was happening, see the blatant discrimination unfolding right in front of them? She looked up at the barista again, forcing herself to breathe steadily. There was no point in letting this define her. She wasn't going to give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her broken. "I don't think I understand," Marcella said, her voice thick with disbelief but firm, as though she was trying to regain control over the situation. She wasn't sure what she expected, the barista's apologetic smile, maybe, or some sort of recognition of her mistake. But nothing came. The barista's face remained expressionless, as though she hadn't said anything wrong, as though Marcella's presence was an inconvenience to be dismissed. You heard me, the barista replied, her words cold, her eyes not even bothering to meet Marcella's anymore. This is a private cafe. You need to leave. The words sliced through Marcella like glass. Her breath caught in her throat as the sting of humiliation surged through her. How many times had she been pushed aside like this? How many times had she been treated like she was invisible, like her worth didn't matter simply because of the color of her skin? Her chest tightened as anger and sadness twisted together, knotting up her insides. It was a mix of everything she had lived through, the rejection, the pain, the constant need to prove that she deserved to be where she was. It was all flooding back, in full force, as though every moment of suffering she had endured had led her to this one, this moment of cruel dismissal. But then, something inside her shifted. She could feel it, deep in her bones. She had spent so long hiding parts of herself, trying to fit into spaces where she wasn't welcome, trying to be accepted by people who would never understand her. But no more. The power she had worked so hard to cultivate, the strength she had built through years of hardship, was rising to the surface. Marcella straightened up, drawing in a deep breath. "I'm the owner of this cafe," she said, her voice steady now, cutting through the air like a blade. The words felt foreign coming out of her mouth, but they were true. She had worked for this. Every step, every late night, every tear shed over this very business. She was the owner. The barista's eyes widened, and her hand faltered over the register. She quickly glanced around, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Wait. You're the..." Marcella didn't wait for her to finish. She turned on her heel and walked out of the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. But inside, she felt something shift. The humiliation still burned, but for the first time in years, she felt her power, her worth, her value. She wasn't just the woman that others tried to erase. She was the woman who had built something from nothing. And no one, could take that from her. Marcella stood outside the cafe, the cold air biting at her skin as she took a deep breath. She could still feel the sting of the barista's words, still taste the bitterness in her mouth. It wasn't just about the incident itself, it was about everything that had led to this moment. The pain, the rejection, the constant reminder that she was never enough in the eyes of some. And now, she had been humiliated in front of strangers who had probably been watching, judging her silently, just as so many others had done throughout her life. Her heels clicked loudly against the pavement as she walked away, her mind racing. Why had she been so affected? She was a successful businesswoman, a woman who had fought tirelessly for everything she had. Why did one careless comment from a stranger feel like it had torn her down completely? She remembered the early years of her life, growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were limited, where doors were often closed because of the color of her skin. Her parents, immigrants from the Caribbean, had worked multiple jobs, scraping by just to provide for her and her siblings. They had tried to shield her from the world's prejudice, but there was only so much they could do. Marcella had grown up feeling like an outsider. She was the girl with the wild, untamable curls, the girl with dark skin that made her stand out in a sea of faces that didn't look like hers. It wasn't just the kids at school who made her feel small, it was the teachers, the neighbors, even her friends. She had learned early on that she had to fight for every inch of space, for every ounce of respect. Her first job had been a tough one. Working in a fast food restaurant, dealing with rude customers who assumed she was just another unskilled worker, a stereotype she could never escape. She had felt the weight of their disdain every single day. And yet, she had never let them see how much it hurt. She had smiled through it all, kept her head high, and worked harder than anyone else. It was when she had saved enough money to start her own business that things began to change. Her dream had always been to create a space where people could feel welcome, no matter who they were. She poured everything into that coffee shop, working long hours, sacrificing time with her family, and dealing with the financial stress of trying to make it all work. But she had done it. She had built something from nothing, and it had been successful. Yet, despite all of this, those old feelings of inadequacy were never far behind. She had always been afraid that people would see her as less than capable, less than worthy. The sting of being rejected or judged was a pain she couldn't shake, no matter how much success she achieved. The coffee shop had been her escape, her sanctuary from the world that had so often made her feel invisible. It was her dream come true, her space to prove that she belonged, that she was just as worthy as anyone else. But now, standing outside in the cold, feeling the weight of that cruel encounter, she wondered if it was all worth it. Was she ever truly safe from the world's judgment? Her mind raced back to the incident, to the barista's words, "We don't serve people like you here." She had never been the type to let people push her around, but this felt different. This wasn't just a random insult, it was a reminder of everything she had fought against. It was a symbol of the systemic forces that sought to hold her down, to make her feel small. Marcella stood there for a moment, her hand gripping the strap of her purse as she tried to steady her breath. Her legs ached, her chest tight with the weight of emotions she couldn't quite articulate. She was tired. Tired of fighting for a place in a world that didn't want her to have one. Tired of carrying the burden of rejection everywhere she went. She closed her eyes, letting the wind whip around her, the cold biting at her skin. She thought of the sacrifices her parents had made, the struggles they had faced just to give her the opportunity to succeed. They had told her to never give up, to always fight for her dreams, no matter how hard it seemed. But now, in this moment, she wasn't sure if she had the strength left to keep going. But then, she remembered something else. She remembered her first cup of coffee in that cafe, the first sip she'd taken after opening the doors to her dream. The feeling of accomplishment, of knowing that she had created something real, something that was hers. Marcella had spent so many years being told she couldn't, being told she wasn't enough, being told she didn't belong. But she had made it. She had fought against the odds and built something meaningful. She wasn't going to let this one moment of humiliation define her. As she opened her eyes, the fog around her seemed to lift. She straightened her back, her posture strong, her resolve unwavering. No one had the right to diminish her, to make her feel like she didn't belong. She wasn't just the woman who had been humiliated by a rude barista. She was the woman who had created something from nothing. She was the woman who had proved herself time and time again. And no one could take that away from her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from her best friend, Lena. "How are you doing? I know it's been a tough day. Want to grab dinner later?" Marcella's fingers hovered over the screen. She thought about it for a moment. She could fall back into the familiar routine, letting the hurt consume her, letting the humiliation eat away at her confidence. Or she could choose something different. She could choose to rise above it. She typed a quick reply, her fingers steady now. "I'm okay. Just needed some time to think. I'll meet you later." She smiled to herself as she put her phone away. She wasn't going to let this define her. She had come too far to let someone else's cruelty stop her. Marcella knew that the path to healing wouldn't be easy. There would be more moments like this, moments where she would be reminded of her pain, of her worthlessness, of the world's indifference. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had proven that she belonged, that she was worthy. And she would keep proving it, every single day. Marcella couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The moment she re-entered her coffee shop, it was as if the air itself had frozen, charged with the tension of yesterday's incident. The walls, which once felt like a comforting embrace, now seemed suffocating. She had to remind herself that this space was hers, that it had always been hers. Yet, she felt like an intruder in her own business, constantly reeling from the shameful memory of how the barista had treated her the day before. She was late opening today, needing time to clear her head after the confrontation. It wasn't just about the words of that barista, it was everything that followed, the silent whispers from the customers, the cold dismissiveness that she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. As she walked behind the counter, she found herself second-guessing every move. Was she doing enough? Was this business truly a reflection of her worth, or was it just another place where her value would be overlooked? The bell above the door jingled as a customer walked in. Marcella immediately straightened her back and put on her best smile. She needed to act like everything was fine, even if her world felt a little shaken. As the customer ordered his drink, she nodded curtly, focusing on the task at hand. There was no room for distraction now. But the man at the counter wasn't looking at her. He was watching the barista, the same young woman who had tried to expel her from the shop the day before. "Can I speak to the manager, please?" he asked, his tone polite, but his eyes narrowed in distrust. Marcella froze. Her pulse quickened as her stomach churned. She knew exactly where this was headed, and it wasn't a place she wanted to go. The barista shot her a look, not meeting Marcella's eyes, as if trying to pretend the previous day had never happened. "I'll be with you in a moment," Marcella said, taking a deep breath and walking toward the back of the counter. She needed to think before responding. What if the customer was here to file a complaint about the incident? What if he had seen everything? Would he side with the barista? Or would he see her as just another angry black woman trying to cause trouble? Marcella hated that this was what her mind always jumped to, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being painted as difficult when all she had ever wanted was to be respected, to be seen. It was exhausting. But she had to face this. She couldn't keep running from the confrontation. After a moment of hesitation, Marcella returned to the front, taking her place at the counter again. She looked at the customer, who still hadn't taken his eyes off the barista. He was watching, waiting, his arms folded across his chest. "I'm the manager here," Marcella said, her voice steady but calm. "How can I help you?" The man's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the barista, whose face had gone pale. The man's expression hardened, and he leaned slightly forward. "I've been coming here for years, and this is the first time I've had an issue. That girl," he gestured toward the barista, who flinched visibly, "tried to throw me out the door this morning for no reason. She said it was private property. I told her I didn't see any signs, and she still insisted I leave." Marcella's heart sank, but she kept her voice even. She wasn't going to let her anger show. "I'm sorry you had that experience. That's certainly not how we treat our customers. I'll look into it immediately." She turned to the barista, whose eyes were wide, her face flushed. "You can go home for today," Marcella said, her tone colder than she intended. "We'll talk about this later." The barista nodded quickly, her lips tight, and without another word, she grabbed her belongings and left. Marcella's eyes lingered on the door as it swung shut. She couldn't help but feel a sense of finality in that moment. This wasn't just about the barista's actions, it was about the broader pattern of mistreatment she had experienced over the years, here, in her own space, in her own shop. Her success was constantly undermined by the people who looked at her and didn't see the full picture. They saw her skin, her gender, and not the years of hard work it had taken to create this place. The man at the counter cleared his throat, bringing Marcella back to reality. "Thank you for taking care of that," he said, his voice softening. "I just wanted you to know, that girl was out of line. I've always loved coming here, but I won't stand for that kind of treatment." Marcella nodded, her eyes briefly closing. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had fought so hard to make her mark in the world. She wasn't going to let anyone, whether a customer or a colleague, make her feel small. She had worked too damn hard for this. "You're welcome," Marcella replied, offering him a small, appreciative smile. "If you ever have any issues, don't hesitate to let me know." As the man took his drink and left, Marcella allowed herself a moment of peace. The shop was quiet again, the tension from the confrontation ebbing away. But her thoughts were still clouded, the questions lingering in her mind. Had she done the right thing? What would happen next? The barista might never return, but Marcella couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. She turned toward the back of the cafe, her eyes landing on the mirror that hung above the counter. For a moment, she studied her reflection, her gaze searching for something, anything, to remind her of who she really was. She wasn't just the woman who had been humiliated. She wasn't just the woman who had built this business from nothing. She was Marcella, strong, resilient, and no longer afraid to claim what was hers. But the question remained, would the world ever see her that way? The days following the confrontation were quieter. The barista hadn't returned to the coffee shop, and Marcella had taken the opportunity to step back and reassess. The shop was her pride, her legacy, but it also felt like a reflection of all the battles she had fought and won. Still, something gnawed at her. She wasn't sure what she expected after the barista's dismissal. Perhaps a sense of closure, but instead, there was a lingering emptiness. Each morning, as Marcella unlocked the cafe doors, she glanced at the space with a sense of dread. The smell of fresh coffee beans filled the air, the sound of steam hissing as the espresso machine worked its magic, but everything felt a little different. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when it happened, but she realized something had changed inside her. The hurt she'd carried, the microaggressions, the subtle ways people had treated her as less than, had begun to fester. She was becoming numb to it, numb to the pain. Her best friend Lena had been texting her nonstop, offering to meet up, but Marcella hadn't been ready. The idea of talking through the emotions swirling inside her felt overwhelming. She didn't know where to start, or even if she wanted to talk about it. The last few years had been filled with struggle, and while she had grown, there were parts of herself that still felt broken. Today, however, Marcella had made a promise to herself, no more hiding. She would face this, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of everyone who had ever tried to silence her. At mid-morning, as she was organizing the shelves behind the counter, the door opened with the familiar jingle of the bell. Marcella looked up, expecting the usual morning rush of regulars, but instead, it was someone she hadn't expected to see, the barista from the other day. She stood at the door, hesitating, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. Marcella's heart skipped a beat. There was no turning back now. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. The barista took a step forward, but then stopped, as if uncertain of how to approach. She seemed smaller, less confident than she had been the day before. Her eyes flicked from Marcella's face to the ground, her shoulders hunched, almost as if she were bracing for something. I wanted to apologize," the barista said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcella's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything. She wanted to hear this, wanted to understand what was going on in the other woman's mind. I didn't know who you were yesterday," the barista continued, her voice wavering. I thought you were just another customer trying to get something for free or causing trouble. I didn't think. I just acted." Marcella stood still for a moment, letting the words sink in. This wasn't the response she had expected. Her initial instinct was to lash out, to let her anger take over. But instead, there was a strange quietness inside her. Something deep within told her that this was the moment for clarity, not conflict. "Why didn't you ask before making assumptions?" Marcella's voice was calm, measured. Why did you assume I was someone who didn't belong here?" The barista flinched, as if Marcella's words had struck her deeply. She seemed to shrink even more, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I've been working here for a while," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I've seen a lot of customers. Some are, well, they're difficult, and I guess I just let it get to me. I'm sorry. I never should have treated you that way." Marcella studied her, the hurt from the previous day still lingering beneath her calm exterior. She had every right to be angry, to feel disrespected. And yet, there was something else, something unfamiliar, growing inside her. It was a kind of understanding. She could see it in the barista's eyes. She was just another person caught in the cycle of fear and assumptions. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," Marcella said, her voice soft but firm. "But I appreciate your apology. And I think you need to understand that people like me, people who've fought every day to get where we are, don't have the luxury of being mistaken for something we're not." The barista nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I'll leave now," she said, turning quickly. "I don't want to make this harder for you." Marcella watched her go, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. She felt strangely empty, her chest tight, as if a piece of her had been torn out and left behind. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, but rather a deep sense of loss. She had hoped that confronting the issue would provide closure, but instead, it had left her grappling with a new kind of discomfort. She exhaled slowly, walking to the back of the cafe and sitting down in the small office she'd set up for herself. Marcella closed her eyes, letting the noise of the cafe fade into the background. She wasn't sure where she was supposed to go from here. The world felt like it was spinning around her, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. And then, as if everything was falling into place, a thought hit her. She had been fighting for recognition, for validation, for so long, but what if, in the process, she had forgotten to truly see herself? She wasn't just the owner of this cafe, trying to prove something to the world. She wasn't just a black woman pushing back against a system that refused to accept her. She was someone who had built something from the ground up, who had survived every hardship with strength and resilience. She had earned her place here, not because of others' validation, but because of her own perseverance. As Marcella stood up and walked back to the counter, something shifted within her. She wasn't going to let the world define her anymore. She wasn't going to wait for approval or recognition. She had already achieved what so many had told her was impossible. She was her own validation. Marcella was standing behind the counter again, the hum of the espresso machine blending with the soft chatter of the morning crowd. She had become accustomed to the rhythm of the shop, the familiar faces, the regular orders. It felt like everything was slowly returning to normal. But there was something deep inside her that told her the peace was fragile, just a layer above the storm that still brewed beneath the surface. The barista who had tried to expel her had never returned. The apology, though sincere, hadn't quite healed the wound. Marcella was still grappling with the weight of being overlooked, dismissed, and misunderstood, all because of her race and her gender. It wasn't just about the incident. It was a culmination of years of experiences where people had made assumptions about her before giving her a chance. She knew it wasn't over yet. The world didn't change overnight, and neither did the subtle prejudices that colored every interaction. But something had shifted. The clarity she had gained in the past few days gave her the courage to continue moving forward with her head held high. She had worked too hard for this place, for her success, for the recognition she deserved. The pain of the past would not dictate her future. And as she continued to serve customers, to run her cafe, and to do everything she had done before, Marcella knew she was building something lasting, not just for herself, but for those who came after her. The doorbell chimed, and Marcella looked up to see a tall, well-dressed man entering the cafe. He was impeccably groomed, with sharp features and an air of confidence that immediately drew the attention of the room. He was a stranger to her, and yet there was something oddly familiar about him. As he walked to the counter, Marcella couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an ordinary customer. He approached the counter, smiling politely but not with warmth. It was more like a smile of calculation, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Good morning," he said smoothly. "I'd like a coffee to go, please." Marcella greeted him with the same professionalism she had shown to every customer before him. As she prepared his order, she couldn't help but notice the way he was looking around the cafe, his eyes narrowing at the decor, the customers, everything. There was something off about him, something unsettling. "You've got a nice place here," he remarked casually, his gaze still scanning the room. "But I can't help but wonder if you're aware of what's been happening with the staff. It's a shame, really. A business like this deserves better management." Marcella's heart skipped a beat, and her pulse quickened. The tone in his voice was no longer casual, it was calculated, patronizing. She'd heard it before, 1,000 times, from people who didn't believe she had earned her place. "I'm the manager here," she said coolly, placing his coffee in front of him with a slight smile. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss?" The man looked at her for a beat, his expression faltering for a split second. He leaned forward slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "It's just... I've been following your shop for a while now," he said. "I know the original owner, he was an old friend of mine. I always thought he had a good vision, but I'm afraid the place has gone downhill since he sold it." Marcella's stomach dropped. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to piece together what he was saying. The original owner? She had bought this cafe years ago, and to her knowledge, the business had always been hers, from the very beginning. She had done everything herself, no investors, no partners, just Marcella. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met," she said slowly, her voice steady. "I've owned this cafe for 5 years now, and it's been a successful venture ever since." The man's smile faltered. His eyes flickered with something else, something Marcella couldn't quite place, but it was more than just surprise. It was a strange mixture of realization and discomfort. "Well," he said, his voice tinged with skepticism, "perhaps I was misinformed. It's just that I've been in the industry for quite some time, and I know a good business when I see one." Marcella was on the verge of asking him to leave when he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the counter, sliding it toward her. "If you ever want to talk about improving your business, let me know," he said smoothly. "I have a lot of connections, and I think you could use a little help to bring it back to where it used to be." Marcella didn't take the card. Instead, she stared at it, her thoughts racing. The original owner, the connections, the way he had approached her, all of it was starting to make sense. She hadn't bought this place from just anyone. She had bought it from someone who had connections, someone who had kept their ties to the business world in the shadows. But what if that man wasn't just a random old friend of the previous owner? What if he knew exactly who Marcella was all along, and the moment he walked in, he had recognized her? The disdain, the coldness in his words, it wasn't just about the cafe. It was about her race, her gender. He hadn't seen a successful businesswoman. He had seen a black woman trying to prove herself. And he hadn't expected her to be the one in charge. Suddenly, it all clicked. The subtle condescension in his words, the way he tried to undermine her confidence, it wasn't about the cafe. It was about controlling her, diminishing her, making her feel like she wasn't worthy of running something so successful. Marcella realized something in that moment, something that took her by surprise. She didn't need his validation. She didn't need anyone to tell her what she could or couldn't do. She had already proven her worth, not to him or anyone else, but to herself. With a steady hand, Marcella slid the business card back toward him. "I'm good," she said with quiet resolve. "Thanks," But no thanks. I've got this. The man stood there for a moment, his eyes narrowing with frustration. But Marcella didn't flinch. She was done letting others define her. She had built this place, her place, and she would continue to build it on her terms. As he left, Marcella stood behind the counter, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had confronted the hurt, the rejection, the assumptions, and now, finally, she had released them. She was more than just a survivor. She was a force in her own right, and no one, could take that from her. And as the door closed behind him, she realized, the real twist wasn't what others thought of her. It was the realization that she had always been enough.